The 10th murderer on this list is Dennis Rader, otherwise known as the BTK Killer. Dennis Rader murdered 10 people in Kansas between 1974 and 1991. Rader sent taunting letters to authorities under the key name BTK, which stood for Blind, Torture, and Kill. Rader stalked his victims before breaking into their homes, breaking their limbs, then strangling them. Having disappeared in 1988, BTK came back in 2005 when he sent a floppy disk to the press, which was a downfall. Some may call this bad luck, but he got traced via the floppy disk. Rader was arrested, charged, and questioned, and then he immediately confessed. He is serving 10 consecutive life sentences with the earliest possible release date of February 26, 2180. Ninth murderer on this list is Peter Shirtcliff. Most of Britain call him the Yorkshire Ripper. Peter William Shirtcliff is a British serial killer known as the Yorkshire Ripper. In 1981, Shirtcliff was convicted of murdering 13 women and attempting to murder 7 others. He targeted prostitutes in Leeds and Bradford area, causing a climate of fear across northern England. When arrested in January 1981 for driving with false number plates, police questioned him about killings and he confessed. At his trial, he pleaded not guilty to murders, but his defense was rejected by the jury. He was sentenced to serve life imprisonment without parole and remains in a Broadmoor maximum security mental hospital to this day. The 8th murderer on this list is Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer is an American serial killer and sex offender who raped, murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He also committed necrophilia and ate parts of his later victims, dismembering and cooking parts of their bodies within his home. Dahmer was eventually caught after a would-be victim managed to overpower him and alert police. In 1992, Dahmer was convicted of 15 of the murders and sentenced to 15 terms of life imprisonment. However, just 2 years into his sentence, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution. Seventh on the list is Dennis Nilsen, or the British equivalent of Jeffrey Dahmer. Dennis Nilsen was a homosexual killer who murdered 15 gay men within his home in London, England between 1978 and 1983. He retained his victims' bodies before dissecting their remains and disposing of their bodies by burning or flushing the remains down the toilet, which led to his capture when human flesh was discovered in his sewage system. Nilsen was convicted in 1983 of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He remains imprisoned at Full Selton Maximum Security Prison in Yorkshire, England, without a chance of release. The 6th murderer on my list today is Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is one of the most well-known serial killers in the 20th century. Ted Bundy is an American serial killer who raped and kidnapped or overpowered numerous young women and girls during the 1970s. Ted Bundy typically approached his female victims in a public place or secluded area where he would sexually assault and kill them. He decapitated at least 12 victims' heads and kept them in his apartment as souvenirs. Repeatedly captured, he twice managed to escape from police and courthouses before going on to commit 3 further killings. Convicted of multiple murders, he was sentenced to death. He was executed by the electric chair in 1989. Fifth murderer on my list is John Wayne Gacy, or the Killer Clown. John Wayne Gacy sexually assaulted and murdered 33 teenage boys and young men in a series of killings between 1972 in 1978 in Chicago, Illinois. He lured victims to his home with the promise of work or money before murdering them by strangling. Gacy buried 26 of his victims in a small space under his home, before disposing of later victims in a river. Convicted of 33 murders, Gacy was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row before he was executed by lethal injection on May the 10th, 1994. Gacy became known as the Killer Clown due to the charitable services and fundraising events, parades, and children's parties where he would dress up as Pogo the Clown, a character he devised himself. The fourth murderer on this list is Pedro Pires. Pedro is a Brazilian serial killer. Arrested in 1973, he was later convicted in 2003 of murdering at least 71 people and sentenced to 128 years imprisonment. Committing his first killing at the age of 14, began a series of burglaries and carried out a murdering spree against local drug dealers in revenge of his girlfriend being killed by criminals whilst he was in prison. By the age of 18 years old, he had killed 10 people. Whilst imprisoned, he executed his own father, who was also serving time for murder. Remarkably, he went on to kill at least 47 other inmates while in prison. Initially sentenced to just 30 years imprisonment, his continued killings have led to a further conviction of his sentence has been increased to 400 years imprisonment. The third last murderer on this list is Daniel Bundy. Daniel was a Colombian serial killer who is believed to have raped and killed over 150 young girls in Colombia and Ecuador during the 1970s and 1980s. He calmly confessed to killing 71 girls in Ecuador after escaping from the Colombian prison. He had led authorities to the dumping grounds of those victims whose bodies had not yet been recovered. After raping his victims, he would hack the girls with a machete. He was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to just 16 years in prison, because the maximum sentence available in Ecuador. In November 1994, he was murdered in prison by a cousin of one of his victims. The second last murderer on this list is Pedro Alonso Lopez. Lopez is also a Colombian serial killer accused of raping and killing more than 300 girls across Southern America and was believed to have preyed on young and vulnerable girls in Peru. He lured them to secluded areas or inside unoccupied buildings where he would rape each of them before killing them by a range of brutal methods, primarily stabbing. Lopez was arrested when he attempted abduction but failed, and he was trapped by market keepers. He confessed to over 300 murders. The police only believed him when he uncovered a mass grave containing many of his victims. Eventually, 53 bodies were discovered. Imprisonment in 1980, he served just 18 years before being released from Ecuadorian prison and was deported to Colombia, where he was re-arrested and in 2002 was sentenced to life imprisonment. And the worst killer of all time, the English doctor himself, Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman. Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman was an English doctor and is one of the world's most prolific serial killers in recorded history, proven to have been responsible for up to 250 murders. A trusted doctor, he was well respected in his community. However, colleagues and local undertakers began raising concern over the high death rate in the area and a large number of cremation forms for elderly women that he had countersigned. It was later established Shipman had purposely injected fatal doses of drug into a huge number of patients, causing their death. He then forged their wills so he could inherit large sums of money and completed cremation requests to destroy the victim's body. The trial sentenced to 15 consecutive years in jail, plus another 15 consecutive life sentences, and recommended that he never be released. Shipman later hung himself in January 2004 in his cell block at Wakeford Prison.